Hi, this is Andy.
And hi, this is Sunny, and you are listening to the Business Over Chai podcast.
Our mission is to share startup stories that will inspire the next generation of entrepreneurs across the South Asian community.
Today we'll be speaking to Prasanna Kannan, who after studying at Oxford and Cambridge started off his career at Goldman Sachs in hedge fund sales. Pras then became portfolio manager at the Sir Elton John AIDS Foundation before co-founding Native Finance in 2015, which is the first European real estate tech platform connecting borrowers and lenders.
Welcome to Business Over Chai. Yeah, I would love to hear your story, where you were born, where you were raised, and then kind of going into your time at university.
Great. Well, firstly, thanks guys for having me. Really appreciate it. So a bit about myself. So my name is Prasanna Kannan, but Prasanna Kannan for the Indians. I'm actually South Indian, so I was born in Chennai in Tamil Nadu. So not many of us South Indians in London these days, but yeah, I was born there, and then I grew up in Tamil Nadu, and I lived there till I was about 7. And it's quite crazy actually thinking about, I don't know, life then. We used to live on the edge of like farms and used to run around without shoes and all this sort of crazy stuff. And India was also a really different time then, so like no one had phones or fridges back then. And it was a very, very insular, country in those days, with just 2 TV channels, power cuts, all those things. And so I think everyone from a more middle class background, at least where we were from, were looking to get out of India. And so when I was 7 or so, my dad got an opportunity to work in Hong Kong, and so we moved to Hong Kong when I was 7, and it was a pretty crazy culture shock. So going from like I said, running around in fields and a very I think one thing I definitely miss about India, and it's obviously I was so young then, and it's a different life now for me, but the real neighborly feeling you get in India, which I've not experienced anywhere else, where at least we're in the community I lived in, no one locked their doors. As a kid, you'd have breakfast at your parents' house and lunch at your friend's house and dinner at someone else's house. And it was a very like friendly neighborhoody feel there. And to go from that to Hong Kong, which, it's the most expensive in terms of real estate city, or previous special territory, but now no longer.
Right.
But city state or whatever you want to call it, in the world. And also, to be honest, at that time, it wasn't a very friendly place for foreigners, but particularly I think non-white foreigners. I think that might have changed a lot since we left. But when we were there, it was very tough being Indian. There were only 30,000 Indians at that time out of about 7 million people in Hong Kong.
Wow.
And I remember, one of the memories of when we first went to Hong Kong, my mum asking some locals where we could buy yogurt, and they were like, "What is yogurt?" So things like that, right? And so it was a bit of a mental sort of culture shock. But I went to I went to international schools in Hong Kong, so I was in Hong Kong for about 4 years or so. And then I'm sure some of you guys know, but in '97, Hong Kong got handed back to China by Britain, and my parents. Turns out correctly, it took a while for that, for their concerns to materialize, but they were concerned about, going back to China or Hong Kong going back to China. And so we managed to, my dad, should I say, managed to get a job over here in the same company. And so we moved across in '98 to London. Obviously knew nothing about London. And you know how these things go. I think another colleague of my dad's, who was a Punjabi guy, had a house in Hounslow and said, "Oh, why don't you stay in my house?" And so, without knowing anything about London or Hounslow or anything, somehow I ended up in Hounslow, and there's that sort of immigrant, sort of, I don't know, relay race, isn't there, of people following everyone into those communities. And one thing that did strike me really when I came to London was just seeing so many Indians, right, in places like Hounslow. It was quite not shocking, but like really, really, pleasantly shocking, I guess, to see that there's so many Indians and ethnic minorities in London. And it felt like a good compromise of, feeling like I was belonging, but also feeling a bit like I wasn't in India. So yeah, I think definitely we were happy to come here, and I think my perception of Britain was much more positive, let's put it that way, than Hong Kong.
So you've moved to Hounslow now. You've basically in this house that a family friend has kind of basically put you in, which was very, very nice of him to do. What happens then?
Yeah, so I went to a state school in Hounslow called Lambton School, which was like a reasonable school, not like the best in the borough or anything, but not the worst either. It was rough in parts. 7 people in my year went to jail, for example. So it had a sort of gritty edge to it, but equally there were kids that did quite well. I think because it's a big immigrant hub, it was a real mix of people. Like there's the Indians who have been there for longer, but then Somalian kids, Kosovan kids, et cetera, et cetera. And so some of those kids obviously came from very tough environments, and that manifested in not such a good way, whereas others, because of that, they had a drive until they achieved and things like that. But nonetheless, my school didn't really have an Oxbridge or an Imperial UCL presence. And so Oxbridge, for example, wasn't something that really crossed my mind. But in my last year, I got invited to a summer school by an organisation called the Oxford Access Scheme, who were an outreach organisation. And that, I owe them so much, because it was just amazing going to this summer school, meeting other state school people like me, who said, you can do this, you can go to Oxford. And so for me, Oxford and Cambridge are sort of, things you read about, and although I kind of thought, I'm pretty smart and I get quite decent grades and stuff, it just seemed still so out of reach. And so I'm really grateful to them for making it feasible or realistic.
Yeah.
And so I ended up getting a place. I was the only Oxbridge kid in my year. There's only like a few every few years, and so went to Oxford to do engineering. So I did engineering, economics and management, which is mostly an engineering degree with a bit of econ and management.
And so what kind of influence did your parents have through that process? I mean, did you just, crush it on your own, and, the exams were there and you would just, was there any influence from your parents in that process of getting to Oxford?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, you know what Indian parents are like, right? My dad would come to parent-teachers evenings and tell me off if I didn't get 100% on any of the maths questions and all that. Or it was very disciplined, I guess, in an academic sense. As in, my parents are quite relaxed, but in terms of academia, they were quite strict. I remember in my GCSEs, my mum making me go through exam papers and stuff, and it was just a bit embarrassing, I guess. But equally, in hindsight, I kind of appreciate that she took the concern and the time. Yeah. I think the biggest impact they had was on me choosing engineering, to be honest. So I'll tell you a funny story. So my dad, when I was figuring out what I wanted to do at university, he walked into my room and he said, when I was your age, I wanted to be a doctor, but we couldn't afford to send me to medical school. So there'd be no greater honour than my son becoming a doctor. And
oh, wow.
And that sort of pressure. And the terrible thing was, I was not particularly a big fan of blood and stuff. And also I did do some volunteering at a hospital in an elderly ward and just really did not like the environment. Yeah. And so I think I compromised in doing engineering, which I think is an interesting sort of recollection as well, because actually, although I was good at maths and stuff, I think my best subject overall was history, right? And I actually was really passionate about history. And so I do wonder sometimes if I wasn't Indian, would I ended up doing history? But having said that, I think Asian parents push you in that direction because ultimately, an engineering degree is more employable, right? So they are doing it because they've got your best interest at heart.
Yeah. Do you find that parents, they just prioritize stability over, because they're coming in from a different country? Or do you find that there is this some other aspect of like entrepreneurship that that Indians or South Asians have at large?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think definitely the stability point, right? It's really interesting, I think, particularly hearing it from British Indians who actually came here with little and succeeded entrepreneurially and still pushing their kids down that stability academia route. I think there is a sort of risk-averse mindset, but it makes sense, right? I mean, like I said, when my dad went to Hong Kong, we had to pay a lady to use her phone to call him, because no one had phones. That when you've been through those sorts of pain points and those sorts of experiences, I think they favour it, and I don't blame them necessarily. It does mean though that there are a lot of Indian doctors and dentists, though, which has its pluses and minuses. But my brother, to give you another example, he from a young age wanted to do music, and so my dad was really set against that. Right, he was like, "No, you're going to pay for your own education, aren't you?" And in the end, my mum had to intervene and say, let him do what he wants, and he's currently doing a PhD at UCLA, and hopefully becoming an academic in music. And he was really the sort of black sheep in the family. But that was, after fighting quite a bit to get his way as well.
Fantastic. So what happened after Oxford then, Praz? What was next in store for you?
So after Oxford, I had an internship at Goldman Sachs in the securities division. So I was on the trading floor. And I think that's actually another influence from my father, rightly or wrongly. But I think from a young age, he'd always talk about stocks and markets and kind of what's going on. And I mean, he wasn't particularly experiencing it himself, but was always sort of intrigued by it. And I think that intrigue was something that caught me from a young age. That was in between doing a master's as well. So I actually got into a master's at Cambridge to do management, but also to do my thesis on microfinance. So it was a weird situation and a weird time, actually, because on the one hand, I was doing this master's more on the sort of social investment, microfinance, that world, and thinking about international development, those things. And in between, I was interning at Goldman Sachs, right? So it's a strange sort of time. And I think, to be honest, in hindsight, it was a crossroads that I'd sort of manufactured because I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my own life, right? And so, so I did an internship at Goldman, and that year was a bit crazy. So at the end of the internship, they said, "Oh, we'll let you know in 2 weeks if you got the job or not." And then, the Sunday before the 2 weeks were up, Lehman Brothers went under, Morgan Stanley and Goldman became bank holding companies, and Merrill got bought by Bank of America. And so overnight, it went from 4 Wall Street investment banks to 0. And I remember, being with my parents at the house and with my brother just going, "Oh my God, I don't know what's going to happen now." And so that year, actually, it was about October time when I actually got an offer to join the year after. And Goldman that year only took on, initially at least, they only took on 30 people across the whole firm. And normally an intake is 120 or so.
What's the difference between, just for our listeners, between a regular finance degree and microfinance? Could you kind of explain a bit more what microfinance covers?
Yeah, so my master's was actually in management, so it wasn't finance. So there is like an MFin course, but my thesis was on microfinance. So I did my thesis. So microfinance is I guess it was pioneered in the 70s in Bangladesh by a guy called Mohammed Yunus and Grameen Bank, and the idea was to provide very small scale loans to people living in poverty or close to poverty, essentially to get rid of or cut out loan sharks who tend to lend in that segment, because banks just don't find it worth their while. And so my thesis, I did it. The professor supervising it was a professor in Cambridge, he's the Nehru Professor for Business, and he's a big academic on frugal innovation and innovation in the developing world. And so I ended up doing my thesis on that and actually going to India, actually back to where I'm from in India. And funny / crazy story is I went on a field trip to a town that my dad lived in for almost 20 years, and I ended up breaking my leg in a car accident in 4 hours, which is a pretty incredible achievement.
Wow.
But I wasn't driving. It was on a field trip. It was, Indian roads are terrible, but I ended up, breaking my leg, having to have quite major surgery, and I've still got a metal rod and things in my leg. And I think actually, in hindsight as well, that was actually quite an important moment in my life in terms of what went or what I decided to do afterwards. And I think in terms of getting perspective about, how quick things can change, right? And how, life is precious and things like that. And so again, if that hadn't happened, I don't know, maybe I'd still be at Goldman today. Who knows?
So what about after Goldman then? So what was next in store for you?
Yeah, and I realized talking through it, my life's been a lot of ups and downs and lefts and rights or whatever. But so yeah, I worked on the trading floor. So I worked in hedge fund sales, so selling interest rate products to macro funds. So it was a valuable experience. Obviously burnished my credentials, and then obviously put me in a career path. I mean, even today, right, like the fact that I worked at Goldman at some point has its benefits and opens doors. But I think quite early on, I realized it wasn't for me. And as I said, with the microfinance and interning at Goldman in between, I think I was a bit caught in two minds at that point anyway. And even before I started, I'd say, oh, I'm going to do my 2 years master's in finance at Goldman and then go traveling. And essentially that's what happened. So I tried to quit about 1.5 years or so in, after I'd got my first fairly reasonable sized bonus. But they gave me a few weeks off and told me to reconsider. And then I thought, okay, well, I'll stick it out for another couple of years because, having been in finance, the way they line up the carrots quite evenly, right? To make sure that they get as much out of you as they can. And so I think I had to wait another 2 years to get a certain bonus and a certain promotion to then leave. And so I was like, okay, I'll do it. I've already done it almost a couple of years. I'll do another couple of years. And then I just stopped caring, to be honest. I just lost the motivation and then wasn't performing as well as I could. And so a few months later, I decided to quit. And the second time, they're actually quite nice about it. And I actually decided to go traveling. But then I came back. I obviously loved traveling, and then I went to Asia and all the way from Japan to New Zealand and had a great time. But it didn't really help me think about what I want to do next, unfortunately. When I came back, all I got to was, okay, I'll try to get into finance again and then get to VP and then quit again and go traveling again. That was the extent of my career plans, unfortunately, at that time. I tried to go back into finance. I applied for a few things. Actually, when I came back in 2012, it was quite low for the market in terms of hiring as well. I almost went back to Goldman, funny enough. So my old partner was trying to get me, or trying to potentially get me back in. There was that going on. But to be honest, it was quite tough. I had a few months of applying and not really getting anywhere. And I think that was quite a shock because as you said, my CV I thought had this sort of stellar progression, and so I'd be able to slot back in. But actually, it was pretty demoralizing. Like trying to applying for jobs every day and not getting anything. And that period lasted for about 3 or 4 months. It wasn't too long. It's not what I wanted to do or enjoyed doing in the first place. Why not look at other things? And so I looked into social investment. And actually, again, this is sort of happenstance thing. The guy I lived with just before Goldman, he actually worked for a social investment fund. And he was the one who first talked about it. And so I started looking for jobs in that area. And I just happened to come across a job posted by the Elton John AIDS Foundation. So it's the charitable foundation of the musician, right, Sir Elton John. And so I applied, got an offer. I was supposed to be meeting the CEO of a PE fund, a real estate PE fund, which actually in hindsight would have been more relevant to what I do now. But, was trying to meet this guy and then trying to delay the other guys. And in the end, I just decided to take the leap and took the job and became the portfolio manager for that foundation.
Okay. What, in layman's terms, what were you doing in that role?
So the foundation, the Elton John AIDS Foundation, it's one of the biggest private HIV foundations in the world. And so I was managing the grants portfolio there. So mostly grant funding, so actually just giving money, but also I was brought in to launch some of their social investment work. So I actually launched one of the first social impact bonds in HIV in the world, and actually one of the first in the UK. And yeah, it was a great job. And to be honest, it's something I might go back to one day. The biggest reason why I left that sector, or at least parked it for now, is unfortunately, one thing about finance that you don't appreciate until you leave finance or consulting or one of these high-powered career fields is it is generally quite meritocratic. Obviously, there's biases, particularly for women, say, that are hard to overcome. But generally speaking, if you are generating more P&L or fees or whatever, you will race up the ladder. And the real world doesn't work like that, and that's true of the non-profit world. And so, it dawned on me that I could do this for 15, 20 years, or I could leave and, do something else and then make a lot of money and come back and I'll still be in the same position. If not, maybe even a better position, because I'll actually have some money under my belt as well to do something about it.
I have to ask a question. Did you ever meet Sir Elton John?
Yeah, no, quite a few times actually. And I was lucky enough to go to, so they used to have an event called the White Tie and Tiara Ball, which was the main fundraiser, which they stopped doing in 2012, 13, I think. And I went to the last few of those, which were at his house actually. So yeah, no, it was an amazing experience, right? You meet all these celebrities, and it has and that's the other thing about the non-profit world is quite strange, because a lot of the fundraising is quite glitzy stuff to try to get money from very wealthy or famous individuals, and then on the other side is all that sort of grassroots stuff. So it's an interesting world for sure, and like I said, one I'd go back into.
You talked about you were traveling and you were inspired by a bookshop that you walked by, and you started up some small idea, and I think this was kind of the inflection point, or maybe a pivoting moment for you, and you're moving from your professional career perhaps to an entrepreneur sort of type of journey. Could you kind of elaborate a bit more on that? When
I came back from traveling, I actually did try to set up a business. So when I came back, when I was trying to look for work and I had some spare time or some spare capacity, I decided to set up a business, and it was based around something I saw on my travels. So I was actually in Indonesia, in a place called Yogyakarta. And I was trying to buy a book, because obviously you have long bus rides and things when you're backpacking. And so I saw about 50 or 100 thriller novels, right? All John Grisham type novels. And I remember thinking, some of these are actually quite good. A lot of them are probably a bit trashy, but some of these are probably actually quite good. Why isn't there an equivalent of a Rotten Tomatoes or something like that for books?
Yeah.
At the time, I didn't know there was a business called Goodreads, which is more like an IMDb for books, but there wasn't a Rotten Tomatoes equivalent for books, right? And so anyway, I came back and I tried to set that up for a few months. I used some freelance guys in India through a contact, put a few K in, not crazy, I think it was like 4 or 5K of my own money in. And then I got the job at the foundation, as I said, and also a team of guys in California raised money from 500 startups who are an early stage investor to do the exact same idea. And so I saw some press about that and was like, well, I'm on my own, and they're in California and they raised money. I'll kind of just let this thing, pass and kind of shut it down really. And I remember at the time just being a bit annoyed at myself, like, oh, I've wasted like 4 or 5 grand to do this thing. What a waste of time and money, and it felt a bit stupid. I don't know, not stupid, but just like, why did I bother?
How long were you working on this project for?
It was only like 3 or 4 months, so it was a bit strange. I don't know, at the time I remember thinking it was really strange. I used to meet this guy, a really nice guy, British Indian guy, who had a team of coders in Kerala, and he was actually Kerala himself. We kind of talked through things, and it was interesting at the time how untech I was, because I'd do a lot of manual things, and he was like, no, you should do it like this. Or just, it was interesting to sort of dip my toe a little bit in that world, but it definitely felt a bit out of my depth a little bit. But shut it down, and as I said, was quite disappointed. But then this is the story about how things all kind of work out, or why no good deed goes unpunished or whatever. By crazy coincidence, so a couple years later, I was on holiday in Croatia with a bunch of friends of mine who were at Goldman, and one of my friends was talking about, she went to some startup event for women in Goldman or something like that, And I said, oh, I tried to set up a startup once. And she was like, really? And then I told her this. I mean, in hindsight, I'm embarrassed to call it a startup. But anyway, I was like, I tried to start up, etc. And she was like, oh, that's really interesting. Okay, I didn't know that. That's really interesting. And why did you give up all that stuff? And so we just had this conversation. And then a year later, again, by just coincidence, a friend of hers from uni had emailed her saying, oh, do you know anyone who might be interested in founding a business with me? And so she was the one who put two and two together. But what I find amazing is that whole thing was 2012 to 15. It was a 3-year story with different touch points in different parts of the world and all those things that could have happened. And so, she connected my co-founder and I met him. And, when I went to see him, I was sort of like, okay, I'm just going to do this because my friend suggested it, but I'm not particularly interested. And even then, it didn't. Although I was really interested in tech and was sort of following it from the sidelines, even then, just the thought of starting something was so alien to me that I was sort of like, I don't know, instantly sort of unsure about it. But I met my co-founder, we hit it off, and I basically said, let's do this, and we took it from there, really.
We're just going to take a quick break. If you like what you're hearing, please remember to hit the subscribe button, and we'd love to hear your feedback, so please remember to leave us a review. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter on our handle Business Over Chai, or on our website at businessoverchai.com. Thanks again, and now back to the podcast. So could you tell us a little bit about Native Finance, Praz, and what it is you do?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll tell you a bit about the journey as well. So when I met my co-founder, he was actually working on it full time. I was still working, but going to pitch meetings and things like that. So I got lucky in the sense that I was able to keep my salary. The idea for it has evolved quite a lot and changed quite a lot. But what we'll be doing now, we'll be doing for the last 3 or so years. So Native Finance is the first tech platform for real estate finance. So we're focused on the B2B side of real estate finance. So things like development finance, you need to raise money to build, some apartments or whatever. Investment finance, you want to buy a hotel, you want to borrow against that, or bridging finance, right, which is more short-term lending as well. And basically, it's a huge market in the UK and generally. So in the UK, it's about 60 billion new loans per annum. About 200 billion in the system overall. In the Eurozone, it's like 300 billion. I think in the US, it's like 3 trillion or something crazy. But in all these markets, there's no real data or tech platforms. Or just any data, full stop. And so what we're doing is we're building the first data platform in that space. I think the best analogy for anyone who's been on the trading floor is an equivalent of a Bloomberg, right? So Bloomberg, 82, prior to Bloomberg, you'd pick up the phone and I don't know how they'd trade bonds actually. I guess it was in person or over the phone, and then you'd have, a little computer you type away and whatever. Bloomberg was the first platform to think about, okay, how can you actually message each other? How can you actually look at live, pricing and things like that? Real estate is kind of in, 82 essentially, right? So in terms of the data side, which makes sense because obviously it's real assets, right? It's a lot lumpier, it's a lot less liquid. But anyway, so we were the first platform to do that, and so we started the business started in 2015 or 16, but the platform's been live since 2018. And since then, we generated around 800 million deal flow, completed almost 100 million, so like really good numbers for a startup. But this year, we've actually made a switch into a SaaS model. We can talk about that, I don't know, now or later, but partly based on the experiences we've had, we've switched to a software as a service, so a subscription-based model, right, like a Netflix. And so we just launched that in July. And we've already had our first 10 or so signups, which is great. And basically trying to get to break even and then hopefully a Series A fundraise. So let's see. The thing, startup, I guess, is all any of these things. This journey never stops, right? So unless you go out of business, there's still more work to do and there's more to do. So even though we've been doing it for a while now, it still feels like we're just starting out in some respects as well.
So you're hoping to raise Series A funding soon. So have you raised any funds in the past then for Native Finance?
Yeah, so we've done a few rounds. I guess, so a bit about the actual journey in terms of how we got started. So as I said, my co-founder was actually doing it full time. I was working full time, but going to pitch meetings. And to be honest, like the initial raise was, looking back now, it's crazy how unprepared and unsophisticated we were. I think partly, the big thing or the big challenge when you try to go into this world is you don't know anyone. What a lot of fintechs and what a lot of tech companies are doing now are so new and so novel, at least in Britain. And I think California is probably the only place, right, where you can swing a bat and hit someone who's worked in a startup or exited a startup or something, right? The first thing we should have done is we should have got, I don't know, Trello or something and set up a little pipeline and research which funds are out there and like targeted them. But I think the big thing you learn, and you guys know this running this podcast, actually having the courage to put yourself out there and just cold call or cold email people doing those things is actually, unless you've done it before, it's quite a scary thing, right? And it's not something you can do if you haven't done it before. And so learning that and becoming brave about that was one of the big things. And so initially we just spoke to people we knew, but luckily through that, through our networks, we were able to get in front of Passion Capital. They were quite a big venture capital fund in fintech. So they're the biggest investors in companies like Monzo and Tide, etc. We were fortunate enough to get backing from them. Just in terms of the journey of that initial raise, we met like 5-10 people, and it's all coffees and no's. And then suddenly it's no until it's a yes, right? It's suddenly you have a coffee with someone, they're like, come back, have another coffee with one of the other partners, come back, here's a term sheet. It happens so fast, right? At that early stage, because funds really are, they're taking a bit of a punt, to be honest. And so they're going off, because they don't have any metrics to judge you on, they're going off the idea, the team, your backgrounds, your likelihood of success, those sorts of things. And so so we raised an initial like a pre-seed round as well, just with Passion. Then a couple of years later, we raised a seed round, so it was Passion again and a number of angels. So we were fortunate enough to have a couple of great angel investors on our cap table as well. Mostly people who were in the finance world. So people like Lord Stevenson, who used to be chairman of HBOS back in the day, and those kinds of guys. And a guy called Brooks Newmark, who set up the UK arm of Apollo, the PE fund. And then we just did a little raise this year, actually, just as a like seed extension, to get to Series A.
Just in terms of, you said it happened so quickly. What's the kind of, is it a massive adrenaline rush? And is there a sense of like, now that someone is offering a term sheet, can you refuse it? Is there any room for negotiation? What's that like in those moments when you do get offered terms?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And to be honest, I think it comes back to that point I made earlier. Like in the UK, we haven't had that first generation of success yet. Like at least in terms of younger people doing tech, right? A lot of what we were doing, we had no one we could turn to, right? We couldn't turn to parents or friends or colleagues or anyone, and so we were navigating it a bit blind. And I think the terms and stuff we got were totally reasonable, so no issues there. But it's crazy to think now about like what we didn't know. Like we didn't know how like options worked, or we didn't know, we didn't know anything, to be honest. Like in hindsight, and a lot of it is about learning by doing, right?
Right.
And I don't know if there is a way you can short circuit that. Obviously, if you have friends you can trust to lean on, that's really helpful. And I think I had a close friend who worked in VC, so he was really helpful in terms of telling us, this is what a pre-money valuation should be for a new business at the time. This is what, these are the ranges. And I think that's the other issue, right? Is a lot of the standards and norms in tech, as you guys know, is unwritten, right? And it changes by the day. The pre-seed round we raised then, now you'd be able to raise 3 or 4 times that, right, for a pre-seed, because there's just so much more capital now in the UK, particularly for fintech. And so, we like looking at the cap table, we felt a bit not hard done by, but we were like, oh, we got a lot less money than we would have. In a way, we could have just not done the idea and waited 2 years and then raised the pre-seed then, and we would have got more money. But it's a very, it's a very much a moving feast, right? And I think a lot of it as well is also how it comes down to how good you're at selling. And I think that's something that both my co-founder and I may be underappreciated. Actually, there's a balance, right, between being great at selling a vision and raising loads of capital and execution. And being able to sell a vision is paramount over execution in some respects. Because ultimately, and I think this is again because so much capital in the system now. But if you have a great idea, if the guy next to you or the girl next to you raises 2 or 3 times as much money to the same idea, then you got to get your skates on. So there's a bit of an arms race thing. But I think coming back to your point, to be honest, we were really unprepared. But having said that, I don't know how you could have been prepared. And it's interesting. A lot of the lessons we've learned doing this, some of the lessons we've learned, we already read about and knew about. But until you walk through that door, it's hard to realize, until you've got, 2 or 3 months of runway left in the bank, you don't realize, why cash is king or queen, right? You don't learn that lesson in its purest form until you really have your backs against the wall. And so I think there is a sort of rite of passage thing, and in a way, failing quickly might be good, because I think it actually immunizes you against failure as well, and that fear of failure. So I hope that answers your question. But I think a lot of it is, to be honest, is flying blind. And so if anyone is interested in setting up a business, I would recommend them. Now I think we're at a stage in the UK where you could find a friend or a friend or a friend who has done it, and to try to tap a mentor or an advisor to give you an inside scoop would be valuable for sure.
So you've kind of transitioned from the big bank of the world, doing a lot of quote unquote manual stuff as you described it, and then you went into tech. Massive transition, I'm sure. But then you also talk about your co-founder. Could you kind of talk about the pros and cons, I should say, of having a co-founder, and like the value in having a co-founder rather than instead of perhaps running your own shop or your own business?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only con of not having the only con of having a co-founder is less equity for yourself, right? In my opinion, everything else is a pro. To my co-founder is ex-McKinsey, so similar background but different skill set, and so we didn't actually know each other that well, as I mentioned, because we were introduced by a friend, but actually we complement each other quite well. He's got, because of McKinsey background, a good strategic brain and amazing at pitch decks, right? And I'm more detail orientated. But I'd strongly recommend anyone looking to set up anything to have a co-founder if they can. I mean, a lot of funds now won't even back businesses without a co-founder, particularly a tech co-founder. And I think one, not mistake, but in hindsight, we should have maybe had a tech co-founder in sooner, or our CTO is not a co-founder, but like a tech person in sooner than we did. Yeah, like I said, apart from not having as much equity, everything else is a pro. And I think, like coming back to your analogy, my analogy always is, a Goldman or someone like that. It's like being, it's like shoveling coal in the Titanic, right? You're part of this huge ocean liner, and so you have your very specialized role where you have one task you do really well. It's tough, but equally you're on a liner, and unless you hit an iceberg, you're fine, right? Whereas we're sort of on a raft, right? It's just us on this little boat trying to navigate these huge waves, and then trying to survive, really. But equally,
I love that analogy.
No, thank you. But the flip side is, when on a raft, you can go anywhere, right? So you're nimble, right. You're quick. You the whole ocean's in front of you. So if you're sharing that experience with people, a very small set of people, if they're employees, it's just not the same. They're not taking the same risk, and they're not taking the same sacrifices or that you are. And so if you're a sole founder, it can be very very lonesome. I actually have some friends who are sole founders, and they kind of lean on me as like an agony aunt or something, and as a surrogate co-founder essentially, which I don't mind doing because they're good friends of mine. But it shows, unless you have a partner or a family support system that you can really lean on and be really honest about, a co-founder is priceless, and the thing is, you think you can do it with a partner, but when if you had to not pay yourselves for a few months, right, all those sorts of things that you have to do in the dark times of setting up business, those aren't things you want to admit to family, right? You don't want to worry them, and you don't want to burden them. And so I think a co-founder is priceless, because they're like, in the whole world, the one other person who's got that shared experience as you, and you can be totally honest with, and you can, live the highs and the lows together. So I think, I'd say it's invaluable, really. The only time I think where you could not have a co-founder is when you're a repeat founder or a second time founder and you succeeded or failed, because the second time you do know how it works and you know how the game works, and so yeah, there's plenty of second time or third time founders going on their own, because they're brave enough, because they know how the game works. That's slightly different, I guess, because you won't have as much angst and doubt in your mind, perhaps, as a first-time founder. But even then, it still would have challenges. So yeah, I'm all for co-founders for sure.
It'd be great to get your take, Praz, as a prop tech or a fintech founder, about the importance of data and tech in businesses. So, coming from an M&A background, I certainly found that PE businesses or acquirers would certainly pay more for businesses, who are tech enabled, as the phrase used to be. What's your kind of take on all sectors kind of, turning into tech and then tech disrupting those? Or do you think that some businesses might just have a tech front end and that's as far as they can go, really? There's a limit or a ceiling to some industries and sectors. What's your kind of take on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I can talk a bit from our own experience as well, and I mentioned it briefly before. So we launched our platform in 2017, start of 2018. We started building this data perspective. So we've now got over 360 lenders on there. We track over 1.5 million loans in the market, so almost the entire lending market. From 2017 to this year, we completed about 100 million transactions. But that was with advisory people, so doing the sort of manual stuff alongside the tech. Mm-hmm. And I think, to your question, that sat a bit uneasy with us, because we realized after a while that we were basically offering a people plus tech solution. And I think my viewpoint has got a bit more nuanced over time. I think when we started out, we were sort of like, tech is the future, tech will solve everything, that sort of thing. But I think where I've landed at now actually is people services and tech, or people solutions and tech solutions, right? And so I'm sure in utopia everything could be automated, but I kind of feel like you want to be in either bucket. So you either want to be pure or like more tech or more people. And so I think, like tech companies at the front end that are more people orientated is not necessarily a bad thing, right? If getting that infrastructure in is crucial. I mean, there's an amazing clip I'd recommend for you guys of Jeff Bezos in 99, right? Where this guy is grilling him and he was saying, you're buying all these warehouses, you're not a tech company. You're not an internet company. And he said, I think he says internet schminternet. He's like, it doesn't matter. Like, as long as we're delivering to a customer, like we're doing it. But Amazon, which we think of as a tech company, I mean, it's really a real estate company with a tech front end, right? And it's one of the most successful companies in the world, with an incredible supply chain, right? And so I think obviously theirs is slightly different because they've got, I'm sure, interesting tech in terms of the warehousing and things like that. But I guess thinking more in terms of fintech, which is not real asset led, I would advise people to choose one or the other, and I think partly based on our own experience. Ultimately, if you choose the tech path, that is inherently more valuable. So one of our investors, angel investors, he's quite senior at a Fortune 500 company. And they acquired a tech business and changed to a tech business, and that apparently increased their valuation 30 or 40% overnight. And so, if you can apply tech to a problem and solve it and gather data and technology, it's hugely valuable right now. And so, I guess to answer your question, I definitely believe the power of tech and everything becoming tech, but I think there are a lot of businesses though that are building solutions where there isn't a problem. And I think the interesting thing for us is switching to SaaS. It's, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge thing, right? We've gone from, you add deals onto our platform, we then manage the process for you using people and then complete it, we then get a commission, to you subscribe to our platform, we don't offer the people services, you manage it yourself. But that shift has fundamentally transformed the way we sort of work with customers. And so I guess the last thing to say on that is, you hear a lot of times about like traction, right? Or trying to build traction, but then also about product market fit. And I think one thing we did and one mistake we made is we confused traction with product market fit. We thought, oh, we're doing all these deals, almost 100 million or whatever, clearly what we're building is needed. But actually, you can force traction using certain levers, whereas genuine product market fit should be, it should be self-fulfilling, right? And it should be like a flywheel effect if you can help it. And so I think, to your thing, I think every sector, every business is going to become a tech business, but some are going to be a tech business faster than others. And if you're looking to build a tech business, it's about thinking about what is, what can tech do and what is the solution, right? I don't know, like take an example, like massage therapists or physiotherapists. That's a people business that will not be automated, but a platform in that scape, might be the right solution and a tech solution, right? And so thinking about those nuances, I think, is really important.
So just talking through native finance and the way that, you've had to pivot a couple of times, and one thing that from our conversations earlier, you talked about was some significant changes in the way that you built the model. And then you went from non-SaaS to SaaS, or traditional tech transaction to SaaS. And you actually kind of did some analysis or surveying of users. Could you talk a bit about that and the learnings that you sort of discovered through that process?
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is kind of coming back to the fact that, looking back at how little we knew, or how amateurish is not the right word, but thinking back now, at least it feels a bit amateurish now, thinking back, we were, in terms of the initial idea. So the initial idea we had was actually slightly different. But regardless, we didn't do a simple survey, simple market research, right, to begin. And I think this is a trap that a lot of founders fall into as well, actually. You're so convinced of an idea or a proposition, you kind of plow ahead, and before it's before you know it, it's a bit too late, right, to change track. And so we've been lucky enough, because we've been a bit careful with our finances and stuff, we've been able to evolve and sustain a journey, which in hindsight we could have done faster. I think we could have got to this point faster if we'd done everything the way we should have. But yeah, so because of the experience we had before making this SaaS switch, we actually did a proper market survey and spoke to 30, 40 contacts we knew who could be potential customers, and got quite detailed feedback. And even then, you don't get all the answers, right? But that was a much more informative way to do it. And I wish, in hindsight, that we had done that in the beginning. But again, first-time founder, you have to make these mistakes. And the way I look at it, the next business I do, I'll be a lot more meticulous and a lot more scientific about it in the approach. And I think, one thing to say is, on all that, I went to, actually, I think it was the same real estate tech conference, or another real estate tech conference. I had this other a VC actually, who worked at some big tech companies before becoming VC. He had quite a good analogy or phrase on this, which is, he said, every business has a fundamental flaw in terms of its assumptions, and the best founders are the ones who discover that flaw quickly and solve it quickly. And I think that's the stuff we didn't necessarily do as well, which is actually how do you quickly, exactly, it's how do you quickly do that. And then I think being more scientific is the way, and then that's what we did this last thing. And like I said, even though we didn't solve everything, but the good news was, because we took that approach, most of the assumptions we had were correct. One or two very small ones weren't correct, but because we'd actually ask people, how much would you pay for this? Would you pay for this? What would you pay for? That sort of stuff. Then we built something they would pay for and priced it where they said they want to, buy it. And thankfully they are buying it. And so it sounds really obvious when you say it, but like I said, a lot of founders don't do it. And I wouldn't be surprised if we're not the only ones who have that experience.
And I guess, one of the elephants, or the biggest elephant in the room right now, Praz, I guess, is this COVID-19 situation we're in. How's that impacted native finance initially, and also what's the larger impact you see on real estate going forward?
Yeah, no, this is obviously a really topical question. So on a business level, it's actually been a bit of a positive, if I'm honest. for us, Q2, we had to basically pause sales, and sort of that obviously delayed things somewhat. But actually, I think the biggest advantage of all this for tech companies in particular is, we're more set up and geared up for this new normal, right? And actually, I think the other thing is that a lot of incumbents are now playing by the rules of tech companies, or sort of our game, essentially, in a way. So I'll give you an example. So a lot of people we speak to wouldn't even know what Zoom was before all this, right? And so if I suggested a video call before all this, not only would they not have been okay with it, they would also, I don't know, they might have been like offended by it. Maybe, am I not important enough to meet face to face? Because the face to face meeting was the paramount, the top thing that you do, right? Or the way things were done. And I think what this has done for at least for tech businesses is made things like video conferencing or video calling acceptable socially. So that's been a big plus. The other thing as well is because of some of the funding announced during COVID, things like the Future Fund, we actually managed to raise some capital through that, which has actually extended our runway quite a bit. So I think on a business level, it's been a positive. On an industry level, though, I think it's a different story somewhat. Real estate is really kind of front and center right now for obvious reasons. The built environment suddenly is, under threat in a sense in terms of how it was before. What is interesting and concerning for real estate is it's been turned upside down, essentially. Almost every asset class, every sector in real estate has had fundamental assumptions and beliefs challenged on an existential level. So the only two sectors I think that are on trend, as it were, are logistics and retail, right? Retail, high street retail was dying anyways. Now it died a bit more, and I guess come back a little bit in some respects. And logistics space was on the up and is even more in demand, right? And in e-commerce, that whole picture and that whole story is probably anything that stayed unscathed. But in every other aspect, residential, suddenly living outside of London looks a lot more attractive. Offices, before all this core office space and having an office building in central London rented to a Goldman or a JP Morgan was the safest thing possible. Now it's probably the least sort of predictable. It's probably still safe, but is it is it kind of obvious what the future looks like? Definitely not. And in everything, right? Retirement living, you can't have young people there anymore, or students, as I said, and so it's quite a challenging time. And I think, unfortunately, the reality of it is going to take time to hit and will manifest itself over the coming years. Yeah, it's on a business level, it's been good. On an industry level, not so good. On a personal level, I had to postpone our wedding, or my wedding, so that's not been good either. Which, again, with Asian parents, has challenges. Like, why don't you get married via Zoom? No, mum, I won't do it. And so it's been a mixed year. But I think, for tech businesses, I think, like I said, it's made things socially acceptable now that just weren't before, and might lead us to being a lot more efficient and a lot more data-driven as well.
I guess the guest list can be as big as it wants on Zoom for a Zoom wedding, right? That's the plus side.
That's the reason, exactly. Exactly.
And you mentioned you would like to perhaps go into social investing back in the in the future, in the longer term, but in the shorter to medium term, what's next for Native Finance and for yourself?
Yeah, so in terms of the business, as I said, we're now focused on the SaaS model. We've already had the first 10 signups in a couple of months, which is great. Trying to get to Series A level right by next year. Or if it's sustaining itself, then maybe we won't even need to raise money. And I think looking up to raising money as an achievement, which is a terrible thing, I think, actually, if you think about it, I think ultimately Series A or in an ideal case, no need for a Series A, right? So that's sort of what's on the horizon. In terms of personally, let's see. I mean, again, it depends on how the business does, but I definitely, as you've seen from what we talked about today, I've had quite an interesting journey, not necessarily one that's gone A to B and kind of had a few twists and turns, but definitely I think what I'm doing now I love, and I think is what I really want to do. And I think, being frank, it's the the only way left to make money, right? For our generation, like, and I think that's a good thing. And I think Obama actually said, he said, you know, the smartest people should be making money, moving money around, right? They should be they should be making money, building things and creating things and challenging things. And so for me, this is really exciting, and it's what I want to do. And I think you touched upon the social investment side and the social side. I think that's the other interesting thing for our generation, you know, given the challenges we face, like climate change and you know, social inequality and things. I think like every business is going to become a tech business. My hope, anyway, is that every business is going to become a social business or a more socially minded business. And so, you know, potentially setting up a couple of, you know, for-profit businesses with a social angle to it is something that's quite interesting for me. But eventually ending up in that world is definitely, you know, an eventuality, I think, or a hope for me. And I think one thing I learned in the foundation was just, well, I had a couple of realizations, but A, just how big the climate change issue is and how pressing it is, but also B, just realizing how much or how many problems or how many issues there are in India, which, I mean, obviously I lived there and I knew about, but just seeing the data around that was quite eye-opening as well. Like, there are more stunted children in India than Africa, right? There are more people in India than Africa right now, right? And so it's quite eye-opening. And so I think for me, India and climate change are the two sort of things I'm really passionate about. So doing something, you know, in either or both, even, who knows, in the future is definitely something that I look forward to doing at some point.
Are there any other sort of entrepreneur or running a business lessons that you would sort of impart to somebody perhaps listening, maybe starting up a tech business, or maybe just some of the skills in business that you've learned very quickly that you would love to share to somebody who's listening today?
Again, we touched upon it a bit, is don't be obsessed with fundraising as well, right? Isn't it that balance of raise at the right times and focus on the business at the right times? And you know, when we got the Tennis Street from Passion, we actually went to a really good friend who's a founder of a big fintech himself, and he said, "Don't take the money." And we were saying, "What do you mean?" And it's interesting in hindsight now, thinking about what he said, and I realized what he meant, which is, you know, you can pivot in enough times, or any number of times when you don't have investors on board. As soon as you have investors on board, you're locked into a vision and to a strategy and to executing that vision to some respects. And so I think there's a real mix of focusing on the business and the fundamentals at the right points and raising at the right points and raising from a position of strength as opposed to a position of weakness. Mm-hmm. And I think the last thing I guess I'd say, which we haven't covered actually, but it's something that I definitely take away from this whole experience is, keeping it simple. I know it sounds like an obvious thing, but it's particularly in things like fintech. I think the best businesses are ones, and VCs love this, by the way. VCs love when they pitched an idea, which when you think about it, it's so obvious it should be there. Like, and so there's a sort of fine line between something that's a bit crazy but so simple. And I think, you know, things like Airbnb or Uber are good examples of this, right? Where if you really thought about Airbnb at the time, although it was crazy and, you know, socially awkward and whatnot, actually when you thought about it on a fundamental level, it was so obvious in a way. And so I think keeping it simple and clear in terms of the vision and what you're trying to achieve and what the business is quite helpful, particularly because you're going to be pitching that idea hundreds of times, right? And when it's something complicated and messy, and the first version of the business that we had was a bit more complicated and messy, it's just a painful experience for you personally, because, you know, you'll speak to 100 people, but 99 of them will probably forget. you'll be the one who's doing it again and again. So I think that that sort of thing, and I think it's a good one to end on, actually thinking about a lot of the older British Indians, right, and then bringing it all full circle, right? You know, our parents who got us to go to good unis and do all those things, you know, a lot of them became very successful or wealthy or well off, you know, running corner shops or, you know, or whatever, or like selling curtains or whatever it might be, and actually kept it simple and then did quite well. And so I think I'd say that's definitely a big thing for me, having a succinct vision.
Finally, our last question is a question we like to ask all our guests. If you could invite 3 guests for chai, who would they be and why?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So The three would be. So first one is Obama. I know this sounds a bit cheesy, but actually he's quite a big inspiration for me. I think I remember in like 2007 watching a documentary in the BBC where they were saying, "Oh, he's such a good candidate, but it's a shame he's a generation too early to become president." And then seeing what he achieved and against the odds, but also doing it with decency and grace, I think is really inspiring. So I'd love to invite him. And then the other two are Indians, but two of them, well, probably two of the most famous Indian men anyway, which is Gandhi and the Buddha. I think again very inspiring to me. Like in terms of being Indian, I'm very proud of a lot of the philosophical insight that a lot of the ancient people had. And I see sort of the Buddha and Gandhiji and Martin Luther King and Mandela and all those guys on that same sort of like relay race. But I find it really fascinating how they took that approach, and so it'd be amazing to especially with the Buddha, right? Find out how did he get that level of insight in 700 BC or whatever, assuming it was one person and not like 5 people, of course. But it'd be great to have those guys for tea and just learn from them really, and just learn about their journeys and how they got to where they are. But they're the people who I'm quite inspired by myself.
Thank you very much for that, Praz. That's been really insightful, and we've enjoyed very much speaking to you.
Yeah, likewise, thank you. Yeah.
Hi there, thanks again for listening to the Business Over Chai podcast. If you like this content, please hit subscribe, and if you have any feedback, please give us a review. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook or Twitter with the handle Business Over Chai, or alternatively on our website businessoverchai.com. Thanks again for listening.